Hello and welcome to GCSE Science with Mrs Castanera. This is the particle model of matter and we're on to lesson 2. So lesson 2 is called density and our keywords are mass, volume, density, kilograms, floating and sinking. And we have here the specification information about what we're learning today, all about the density equation and all about what density is. So I'd like you to pause the video whilst you complete the knowledge check, please, on page 10. Okay, so let's go through those answers now. Question 1. Describe a solid in terms of the movement of particles. Well, particles vibrate slowly in fixed positions. Question 2. Describe a liquid in terms of movement of particles. Particles vibrate and can flow randomly but are all touching. Question 3. Describe the arrangement of particles in a gas. Particles vibrate quickly and are free to move randomly with large gaps between them. Now please make sure you're marking in a pen of a different colour and that you are adding and annotating your answers to make sure that the correct answers are written out, and ticking the answers if you've already written them fully correctly. Question 4, what are the units of temperature? Well, that is degrees Celsius. Occasionally we might use degrees Kelvin, which is capital K, but degrees Celsius is the better and preferred answer at this time. Question 5. Identify the equation for density. So density is mass divided by volume. And you can have any rearrangement of that. So that would be mass equals density times volume, or volume equals mass divided by density. Question 6. Name the unit of density. That would be kilograms per meters cubed. Question 7. Write what centimetres cubed refers to, or cm to 3, and that is centimetres cubed. Question 8. What force must you break to change states of matter? That's the intermolecular bonds or the intermolecular forces. So give yourself a mark out of 8 for those questions. Now today, our overview for the lesson is that we're going to be able to define density and recall its units. We're going to describe density in terms of the particle arrangement. So, learning activity 1, steel versus feathers. So there's a video entitled Limmy's Show, all about what's heavier, a kilogram of steel or a kilogram of feathers. Okay, and there's a video at this YouTube address here. So if you pause the video and watch that YouTube clip and then return to the video once you're done. Okay, so let's review our answer. So Limmy thinks it's the mass, which is how heavy an item is, that is decided by its density, which is how heavy something is for its size. Limmy doesn't realise that you can measure out 1 kilogram of any material. Sometimes this is a tiny amount, such as high density materials, such as steel. And sometimes 1 kilogram is a very large amount of the material, such as a low density material like feathers. So when thinking about the steel and the feathers, Limmy is confusing the mass of each substance, the amount of matter an object has, with the density of each substance. Okay, so tick that if you've got it right and annotate any additions that you need. Feel free to use the student notes page if that will help you. I'm going to highlight this key sentence here. This is a definition. The density of a substance, which is represented by the Greek letter rho, sometimes shown as this symbol, like a curvy P, okay, is defined as its mass per unit volume. That's the number of kilograms per 1 meter cubed. And so the units for that, for density, are kilograms per meters cubed. So 1 kilogram of steel, 1 kilogram of feathers have the same mass, 1 kilogram. But as the video showed, the steel takes up a much smaller volume. Volume is the three-dimensional space an object takes up. For a regular shaped object, such as a cube, volume can just be calculated by measuring its length by its width by its height. Therefore, the steel has a higher density than the feathers because it has the same mass as the feathers, but in a much smaller volume. So now I'd like you to answer the checkpoint question. What is the definition of density and what are the units? So pause the video whilst you do that, please. So let's review our answer. Density is the mass per unit volume. That's the number of kilograms per 1 metre cubed. So your first mark is a definition of density, okay, which is all about saying it's mass per unit volume. And the units for this are kilograms per metres cubed, so that's your second mark here. So give yourself a mark out of 2, please. Now, unfortunately, we can't do the floating or sinking activity as we just don't have practical ability online. If you wanted to, you could find a copper coin or a primarily copper coin, such as a 2p piece or a 1p piece, or any coin, and see if it will float in perhaps a kitchen sink or a bowl of water. And you can try the same thing with another object that's very light for its size. There are lots of things that are very light for their size. I'm sure you could find something around your house. Many plastic objects are quite light for their size and of low density. So to summarise this practical, a small, lighter copper coin will sink, but a much larger, heavier wooden block will float. And that is because the copper coin has a much greater density than water. Okay, so it sinks. And the wooden block has a smaller density in water, so it floats. And it's not about whether it's a large object or a small object, it's about whether the object that's displacing the water is heavier or lighter than the water it has displaced. Okay, so the large wooden block, although it's quite heavy, it's displaced so much water that when you weigh the total volume of water that that block has displaced, it is still lighter than the wood. Whereas the copper coin is quite heavy for its size, and so it only displaces a very small amount of water, but the coin is much heavier than that small amount of water that it has displaced. So let's write a little bit about this. Okay, so floating will occur if the object weighs less than the volume of water it has displaced. And this is why big steel ships float, because although they're made of steel, and you think, well, steel's really, really heavy, it's really dense, it's really heavy for its size. Inside that steel boat, the massive steel ship, is a very large volume of air inside it. Okay, and although the steel is genuinely much heavier than the water that the steel is displacing, most of the water that is displaced is being replaced with air, which is considerably lighter than the water. So on average, the weight of the air and the steel and all the other materials inside that ship or boat are lighter than the amount of water that is being displaced by the ship or boat. And that means that that ship will then float, because on average, when you take into account the amount of air, it is much lighter than the water being displaced. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so the learning activity 3, properties of a substance, density. So looking at the diagrams of solid, liquid and gas below, in the box below the diagram, can you identify and explain which state of matter has the highest density? And remember that density is the mass that something has for its size. It's the amount of mass per unit of volume. Okay. So pause the video whilst you answer that question in each of the boxes, please. Okay, so we're going to mark that now. So solids, it's the highest density. So you get a mark for the highest density for solid and the lowest density for gas, and identifying that liquid is of a middle or medium density. So 3 marks straight away for identifying which ones have the highest and lowest density. Now, solids have the highest density because there are more particles in the same amount of space. Okay, so it's the idea that there is more stuff, more mass, in the same amount of space or volume. Second mark. So the idea that for a liquid there are less particles in the same amount of space, or there is less mass than a solid in the same amount of volume. Okay, so you can talk about space or volume, or particles or mass. And for a gas, the idea that there is very few or less than liquid, so there are very few particles or mass in the same amount of space or volume. So that is out of 6 there. Okay, make sure that if you haven't got all those correct or perfect, that you write them out correctly. Feel free to use the notes page to do this, or the space around the boxes. Okay, so we're going to move on. Solids normally have the highest density, followed by liquids and then gases, which have the lowest density. Consider a fixed mass of a substance. For example, 10 grams of sodium. In the solid state, the sodium atoms are tightly packed together in a small volume. So in the solid state, sodium will have a high density. The same mass of sodium in a liquid state would take up a greater amount of volume, so it will have a lower density. The same mass of sodium in a gaseous state, or as a gas, would take up an even greater volume, so it will have an even lower density again. However, there are a few, not very many, exceptions to this. So, for example, water. Okay, so bizarrely, ice cubes float on liquid water. Okay, so solid ice is lighter than liquid water. And to learn more about this, you're going to watch this video here on YouTube. Okay, and you're going to pause the video whilst you watch that clip on YouTube, please. Okay, welcome back. So today's checkpoint, or at least this section's checkpoint, state the different states of matter in order from least dense to most dense in terms of the density of atoms. So in order from least dense to most dense. Pause the video whilst you answer that checkpoint question, please. Okay, let's go through that. So the gas is the least dense, then liquid, then solid is the most dense. Now the whole thing, you can get 2 marks for having the order correct. You need all 3 to get full marks. So for 3 right in the correct order, you get 2 marks, sorry. And then for 2 correct in the correct order, you'll get 1 mark. Okay, we're going to move on. Okay, so we're on page 12 now. I'd like you to pause the video whilst you complete the knowledge check questions, and then we'll go through them together. Please pause the video now. So let's review our answers to the knowledge check questions. Normally, which state of matter is most dense? Solid. Which state of matter is least dense? Gas. What 2 factors does density depend on? That would be mass and volume, and you need both of them correct to get the mark. Name the symbol for density. So it's this P symbol, which you can also have drawn like a sort of funny P, almost like an E. Why does copper sink in water? That's because copper is denser than the water it displaces. Okay, if you've written heavier than the water it displaces, that's also acceptable. And if you've just written that copper is denser than water, that is also acceptable. So question 6, which state of matter has the greatest density? Well, solid. What are the bonds between metal and non-metals? Those are ionic bonds. What are the bonds between non-metals? That would be covalent bonds. Now give yourself a mark out of 8, please. If you've got 5 or more, then you're doing very well. If you have got 4 or less, then you need to have another look at this lesson, review the work so that you get a better score, because 5 really is the minimum you need to be getting on this. 4 or 5 is absolute minimum. There's also the summary video available on YouTube. It's quite a long link to type in, so if you have a digital copy of this, you can always just click on the link in the document. Okay, so before we finish our lesson, I'd like to put you in the direction of the keywords. Okay, so you need to know these keywords and you need to be able to define them. It doesn't have to be word for word, but it does have to be very close to the definition. Okay, so floating and sinking, we can allow a little bit of difference, but something such as volume or mass or density, then you're going to need to know it almost exactly word for word. Okay, and that's the end of our lesson. If you have any questions, please email your teacher and we'll be very happy to help.